Welcome to Teaching Orchestra. What are backwards extensions? For the sake of this video, I'm going to define a backwards extension as a way to reach backward or towards the pegs to lower a fingering 1/2 step. In contrast, half position is where there's a shift with the whole hand 1/2 step lower or towards the pegs. Which one should you do for Sahara crossing? Yes. Let me explain. This page that corresponds to Sahara crossing, here they're teaching a backwards extension. How do I know this is half position? Look at the thumb. The thumb, and this is the violin book by the way, is behind the first finger tape. In this case, there's no tape, but you can imagine where it would be. You may or may not have tapes on your students' instruments at this point, but I just want you to look at the thumb. That's the point I'm trying to make. In half position, the thumb moves backwards even with the first finger. Since the thumb is in between the first and second finger, we're using an extension. For cellists, whether or not they move their thumb back depends on what comes after the E flat. So if the note that comes after is an E natural or eventually appears in the pattern, then second finger would be used to play the E natural. And since the thumb follows the second finger, they would need to shift back to get it. But in Sahara crossing, they use a backwards extension because E natural is not included in this pattern simultaneously. The fingering indicator is generally X2 instead of X1, which is just kind of a semantic thing and arguing about which finger is extending. It doesn't really change the way cellists play Sahara crossing, but to get to the point, which maybe I should have done from the beginning, make sure your students' thumbs stay in place, because if they shift backwards towards the pegs, they could pull other notes out of tune. Let's look at measure 43 to see a visual representation of what I'm talking about. We go from a backwards extension indicated as X1 and then eventually have to play a G on the D string with their fourth finger. If they don't extend backwards and shift back, the G could be out of tune, usually flat. And if they don't shift back correctly, there really isn't a reason to shift. And there's more of a reason to use a backwards extension. All right, let's get to the bass players. This concept matters too because the E flat is first finger, F is fourth finger. But using an extension, it's the first finger for E flat, first finger for F natural, and fourth finger for F sharp. In Sahara crossing specifically, it has B flats descending in the cello and bass parts, and it indicates to use half position in the bass part. So D is open, C is fourth finger, and B flat is first finger, and A is open. There's absolutely no reason to do an extension here, yet your bass players, even despite having the fingerings written in, may play second finger C instead of fourth finger. And where should the thumb be? Behind the first finger tape, all right? If they don't have tapes, that's okay. Just use it for reference, all right? So we've covered the bass players, and they should be using half position instead of extensions with their thumbs on the first finger tapes. We've talked about the cellos and how they should extend. However, the notation is irrelevant. It's just a semantic thing. So now let's talk about the violins and violas. This is where it gets a little more complicated. You can make an argument for the extension or the argument for half position. For the extension, it's just like the Strictly Strings book. The thumb stays in the same spot and they just reach back for the E flats with the first finger. If the students don't have any exposure to half position and they're following along in the Strictly Strings books, it might not be a bad idea and it might be faster for them to learn it that way for Sahara crossing. Learning backwards extensions instead of half position can help speed this along. You can delay learning half position and it will get them through this just fine. In fact, I've seen several groups do this successfully. So what are the trade-offs? Well, The obvious trade-off is that they don't learn half position. So if you're delaying that technique, they might get behind in that area. So the less obvious trade-off is usually the intonation. And I say usually because some groups do just fine, but other groups struggle who may have not struggled when they learn half position. So why do I think that? Well, because when you're learning extensions, you're learning fingerings, right? Whoa, one, right? With half position, you learn the entire tetrachord. In the teaching companion, available on teachingorchestra.com, I start with finger patterns just like I do with all teaching companions. And that way, they learn the sounds and not just the fingerings. From my experience, this establishes much more consistent intonation much faster and leads to much better results. Here's the first page of the teaching companion where we work on the major pattern here and the open pattern here in half position on the D string, the minor pattern on the A string, and the augmented pattern in half position on the A string. This works best if you're teaching half position rather than the backwards extension. Hey, but you're a versatile teacher, right? Why not teach it both ways? Why not teach the extension and half position where it's appropriate? And I think Sahara Crossing is great for this because you can try it both ways and students can learn a lot of technique while playing something that's a lot of fun. And I recommend taking advantage of it because it'll help your students with even more difficult literature, and it's a good bridge to some of the grade 3 pieces that they're likely to play next. In my next episode, I'm going to go over phrasing, and I hope to see you then.